Well, it is exactly at the top of the hour. Welcome to News Check on this, the 20th of January 2026. Our keen focus this morning will be on the plight of refugees in the first hour, while in the second hour, given that it is January, we will concern ourselves when it comes to Cervical Cancer Awareness Month. We'll continue that particular conversation that started in Good Morning Kenya, and we'll carry it here in News Check also. We're keeping tabs on other stories making headlines at this hour, including a press conference in regards to a crackdown and arrest of rogue labor recruitment agencies, where the Cabinet Secretary of the Ministry of Labour and Social Protection will be speaking to the members of the press in regards to that, as well at the NSSF building. We're also keeping tabs on a committee that started in regards to the sharing of the Safaricom shares, where the Departmental Committee on Finance and National Planning, jointly with the Select Committee on Public Debt and Privatization, will carry on with their conversation. Today, the people who will be before that particular committee is none other than Kiharu Member of Parliament Ndidi Nyoro. Will be having CBK represented, also the Consumer Federation Kenya, Institute of Public Finance, and the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner. Kotu will be represented, and then finally they will conclude the day with a religious organization. We're also keeping tabs on another briefing that will be happening in the next few minutes, where professionals from the Luo community I will be speaking to the members of the press in regards to Kenya's current political development, inclusive governance, and the implementation of agreed national reforms and frameworks. And then finally, we do have a briefing from the National Cohesion and Integration Commission, that is the NCIC, in regards to social media monitoring guidelines, where the Kenya National Action Plan on Hate Speech and Radical Ideologies and the Gender Analysis Report. Those are some of the stories that we'll be sharing with you in due course of this particular program, as and when we conclude it at exactly 11:55. If you're just joining us, we'll be concerning ourselves in the first hour with the plight of refugees, following the backdrop of what happened last year, where President Donald Trump cut aids, especially through USAID, that was helping some of the biggest camps we have here in this particular country, including Kakuma and Dadaab. My name is Abdiaziz Hashim. A little bit of few statistics before I introduce my guest this morning. Kenya hosts over 850,000 refugees and asylum seekers, primarily from Somalia, South Sudan, concentrated in Dadaab and Kakuma camps, where over 80% reside in Dadaab and Kakuma settlements for the past few years. Now, how has this been affected, especially following the decision by President Donald Trump to cut those aids, especially not only but USAID, also we have seen even some of the European countries cutting specifically aids to those particular camps. How has this affected some of the operations? We do have representations of people who have been in those grounds, and they'll be telling us more about it. Joining us this morning is none other than Mitchell Ambasu. He is the Refugee Consortium of Kenya RCK Field Coordinator at Kakuma Operations. Welcome, Mitchell.
Thank you. Good morning, viewers.
Good morning to you too as well. Next to Mitchell, we do have Mohammed Ahmed. He is a program manager and legal aid at RCK. Mohammed, karibu sana.
Good morning. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And maybe we start with you, Mitchell. Paint a picture for us. How is Kakuma and Dadaab looking like a year later after what happened last year?
Thank you for that, Abdiaziz. If you look at within the shifting priorities, and here we're looking at the shift. We had what we call the humanitarian support, but now we're having what we call the humanitarian development nexus. And that, of course, looks at how are we approaching support to asylum seekers and refugees. And within the Kakuma context and also the Dadaab context, we've been having this ongoing conversation. Recently, if you've been following the news, the
Kenya is home to
the Republic of Kenya was able to launch what we call the Shirika Plan. The Shirika Plan looks at having socio-economic integration, specifically for the refugee hosting areas. And if you look at that now, of course, ties into what has been happening globally and within the region. One key factor, of course, is the shrinking donor fund, as you've rightly mentioned. And this, of course, affects some of the service delivery. Looking at the spaces of where we work, we have very vulnerable groups. These are people who have fled their country, coming to seek asylum. And we look at it from the point that Kenya, being a host country, it presumes the responsibility of taking care of these vulnerable groups. But of course, within the regional and international conversation, we're having conversation on how do we ensure there's burden sharing, but also at the same time, how do we ensure that service delivery is affecting each and every one. So from RCK, that is Refugee Consortium of Kenya, We are an advocacy organization, and we've been working very closely within the legal space. We have the mental psychosocial support programs, we have the peace and social justice programs, and also women and economic empowerment. Recently, we were celebrating 25 years of impact, just trying to see how do we bridge the gap. And of course, for us, from an advocacy point of view, we are asking the key question: are the protection needs for all these refugees and asylum seekers being taken into consideration? We understand, of course, within the context that we work in, there's the need for laws and regulations and policies to inform even these changes. But from where we sit, we look at the social change and also the systemic change. On the social change, of course, we're trying to bring the conversation to the refugees, that is the affected communities, so that we understand that from their feedback, how are they taking this new information? Because as much as at the policy level we might be having this shift on changes, but also it requires involvement of the people. So that's what we call the people-centered approach. I think within the sector we've had, the one mostly affecting the refugees is the differentiated assistance model, which one of course focuses on the support to the vulnerable groups. The categorization of course had some bit of hiccups here and there, but I think the units here, the government of Kenya and also World Food Programme were able to interact and engage with the communities, that is the refugee communities, on their feedback, so that within the categorization they have been having cases of recourse mechanism in case maybe someone felt they've been wrongfully categorized or maybe information that was lacking. But of course this is an ongoing conversation, and for us where we sit as also RCK, we are asking on the systemic change. Are the policies inclusive enough? So that even we are having within our constitution affirmative action, how are we factoring the women, how are we factoring the person with disability, how are we factoring the children? So that if you look at within the population statistics package from UNHCR, you realize majority of the refugees or asylum seekers are women and children. Close to around 73%. So this is a very big population, and if you look at our constitution in terms of affirmative action, special consideration should be taken into measures, and especially when providing service delivery to these specifically vulnerable groups. Yeah.
And indeed, Mohammed, given that you're program manager at RCK, maybe how has it been difficult, especially to manage and aid these particular camps in the advent of what the United States and other donors have done?
Thank you, Hashim. Indeed, it has been tough ever since the pronunciation of Trump and the Dublin funds. Of course, as organizations, every year when we do our reporting, we do risk assessments, we do disaster management to try and foresee what will happen for the next year and just start planning prior to that. But it hit many organizations. It has hit the camps even more. Of course, we are looking at personnel. More than 60 to 50% of personnel offering service delivery being pulled out from operations in Dadaab and Kakuma. In operations where there were key protection agencies that were handling these issues to do with gender-based violence, issues to do with resettlement, issues to do with durable solutions, have been pulled out of the operations because there's no funding. People lock up doors, and we have to look at the repercussions. What will happen if these organizations lock their doors? Which means service delivery is not being offered at the highest level as it will require it to be. And if you look at the borders, we are not expecting a less number in migration. The numbers will evidently still go up. We are looking at the special rapporteur on migration. We are still foreseeing the high increase of numbers. You see what is happening in South Sudan. You see what is happening in Congo and other parts of the country. We are still foreseeing that there is a large population that will be coming in, but in terms of the service that we have, and the funding that we have to be able to cater for asylum-related cases is quite low. That's why we're looking at something called, and I'm glad my colleague mentioned it a bit, there's the whole setup about integrated governance that is coming to Dadaab and Kakuma. For so long, the camps have been situated where they have to get their services from the main area. Kakuma gets their government services from Lodwar, and Dadaab get them from Garissa County. What the county governments have done is devolve these functions into municipalities. A fully functional municipality where they can get the services easily to their doorstep rather than them making the step. And then there's another conundrum that happens, the movement part. Of course, we are still part of the encampment policy, of which RCK is trying to advocate for. The encampment policy doesn't allow them to move freely as much as they would hope to. If you look at the Somali community, if you look at the other communities in Turkana, they are very much a community that likes to roam around. They are pastoralists, they're nomads. Many of them do business in the other parts of the border. So in terms of them moving around and trying to get these services, it's hard. what we used to do is to have one-stop shops. Sometimes we have KRA come over, Huduma come over, and give them these business registration services. But what is happening right now in integrated governance, the municipalities are situated in the camps, and Mitch will speak about it. But there's a program that we're now running in institutionally capacity building these institutions to be able to offer these services to the large population that come to our doorstep, even the ones that we foresee coming, that we can be able to offer services to them, even with the dwindling funds. Of course, it's hard. It's a bit tight. Organizations are handling 2 or 3 mandates out of their scope to try and cover what is happening. But we are hopeful that things will get better in the near future.
Maybe as you expound on that, Michelle, especially when it comes to the municipality and how they are running within those particular camps, what are some of the challenges these refugees are currently facing?
Thank you for that. Yeah, if you look at within the devolved system, because as a country within our constitution, we have the devolved system of government, and some of those services are devolved at the municipality level. We have the Garissa County and also Turkana County giving the charters to the municipality, that is Kakuma municipality and Dadaab, so that they can provide these integrated services to both refugees and the hosting communities. Looking at some of the challenges, of course, we have the one which is within our ambit, is the legal and administrative barriers, because you look at in any context, there is the laws and policies, but sometimes the laws and policies either overlap or are parallel to each other. So that even in terms of accessing these basic services, we are trying to push the conversation forward. Are the policies at the county assembly level speaking to the issues that are affecting maybe the refugees and the host community? I'll give you a clear example. For instance, in terms of access to water, it is not presumed that when you're going to maybe fetch water, there's a tag on you, either you're a refugee or a hosting community. So in terms of service delivery, we are also pushing the conversation with the county government. We have a long-standing relationship with the county government of Turkana and also the county assembly of Turkana. And if you look at the county assembly, they play a very important role. That is legislation, oversight and representation. For the longest time, of course, you look at legislation, laws are being passed, but we are now asking the question on representation and oversight. So that even for those projects that we have like-minded partners within the operations that are trying to maybe provide services like access to water, education, and also healthcare, are they also in line with what the aspirations of the Kenyan laws provide? So that within that specific ambit, it provides some centrality and commonality in application of law, so that we don't have that aspect of one partner maybe doing something that maybe violates a law within the context, but also ensuring that within the community, there's awareness sessions on what is the most important information they require and how can they ventilate. Recently, we have the County Assembly of Turkana amending their standing orders to include refugees to be able to petition the County Assembly on issues that are affecting them. So you see now when you're talking about the legal and administrative barriers, we are already pushing this conversation forward on how does the County Assembly also on board or give an opportunity to refugees in case maybe their access to basic services like education, water and health, and maybe also to stage further to sanitation, where they would want maybe to present a memorandum to the County Assembly on service delivery. How do they support that? We've been working, of course, with the project, as you mentioned, with the support of the Danish Embassy on institutional capacity of both the national and county government. And here we're asking the key questions. If you look at the Global Compact on Safe and Orderly Migration, it provides a basic aspect that when asylum seekers or migrants are accessing their rights, the human rights, then it needs also to provide that safe access to basic services. So in this particular capacity building, we are doing a lot of sensitization and training, specifically on the human rights-based approach. How do they ensure that even within the smallest constituent level, that they're ensuring that whatever good or maybe laws that are being passed are also accommodating the vulnerable group that I mentioned. Another key challenge, of course, as I mentioned, is the limited resources. You rightly mentioned on the shifting priorities. We call them shifting donor priorities. And if you look at within Kakuma and also Dadaab, majority of the refugee and asylum seekers are within the East Africa and Horn of Africa region. So it means it's an East Africa problem. So that even in terms of designing solutions, we need to start looking inwardly. Is maybe what within our our relationship, either cross-border or maybe within the territory, are providing these avenues for even the refugees who are crossing border. One, for them maybe to be repatriated back to their country so that they can also contribute. But in the case where maybe there are those vulnerable that still require the support of Kenya, then the government also, in terms of budget allocation, they're also putting some substantial. We have the Refugee Act of 2021, which RCK was on the forefront in terms of pushing for a law that specifically talks about refugee protection and management. And within this law, of course, we have some key, I would say, clauses that speak to access to services, where you'll see that it mentions on support to vulnerable children, women, and maybe persons with disability. But now the implementation aspect requires resources. So with limited resources is where now we're having the conversation, even at the county level in the budget making process, can we be able to have gender sensitive budgeting so that even at this particular point where you feel maybe one particular group might be disadvantaged, the information of course goes out to the community and then they get feedback so that even when they're designing these specific laws, it is all inclusive. So that if you look at the whole Alliance on Inclusive Refugee Responses, it is not talking about only refugees, but also asking from the host community level, what are these key asks that maybe when we're doing maybe parallel service delivery, can we be able to integrate them? So that we look at some of the projects that are being run at the moment, you'd realize we are regularizing the integrated service delivery, be it in the education sector, be it in the healthcare sector, and also be it in the access to border. Yeah.
And coming to that, given that you've raised a very pertinent question, in terms of how crucial is Kenya solving some of the diplomatic issues we're witnessing across our borders, and not only in South Sudan, you're witnessing what is happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Mohammed, you've just clearly stated that you could see even the numbers rising because you see they have nowhere else to go. Yeah. They will either go to Kenya, Tanzania, or Uganda. They choose where they need to go because of whatever is happening in the country. So how crucial is the peace process, especially for DRC and South Sudan, crucial in aiding, not only suffocating RCK and other donors who are trying to help these camps? So how crucial is that peace process, especially in South Sudan and DRC?
I would say very important. At the end of the day, when you're focusing, you're looking at the risk matrix about the population that you are presuming that will come to our borders. You look at DRC, you look at Sudan, we've been receiving refugees as far as Yemen from over the years. So I would say even Palestinian refugees might find their way somewhere near South Africa and they channel into Kenya. And the reason is, I think, in our laws and policies, and recently we had an East African forum where we invited the East African community in terms of just sharing, information sharing on how access to labor markets is for them. And what we have the report and we were broadcasting it, and what was shared is in Uganda you'll find that they're more inclusive, they are more integrated into settlements than they are into camps. They're way ahead, while their policies still remain behind. In Tanzania, it was termed as the policies, yes, they might be there, they might be requiring a little interpretation of the laws sometimes. In Kenya, we are so far ahead in terms of policy and law, but the problem is the implementation part. And that is what we are trying to focus on now in RCK in terms of advocacy. Yes, we have a lot of these laws, but are they expensive PDFs that are shelved because maybe the implementation matrix requires funding, maybe you need to institutionally capacity build or strengthen the government or the ministries that are implementing to even have funds for that. So in terms of that, there's also political goodwill from the two countries that are hosting the refugees. So I would say the peace process also, it's a international agenda that will still trickle down into what will happen in terms of our borders. You'll find in law, they will say there's someone called a prima facie refugee and there's someone who's not a prima facie refugee. And prima facie just means on the face of it that you require attention and we have to bring you in terms of asylum migrated cases. So in terms of prima facie refugees, there are states that have it and states that don't have it, which means you will only become a prima facie refugee if it's all known to us that your country is experiencing turbulence and war and conflict, that if we come, we don't need to ask you and verify you on why you're coming into the country. As opposed to someone who will be coming from a peaceful country, then we really have to ask, why are you coming into this country as a refugee? Well, it is known globally that you understand where the peace...
And maybe,
yeah.
Maybe just also to add on the same conversation, because you've asked about the Kenyan content, how we can contribute. I think from our 25 years in terms of doing advocacy, what we realized also is this limited mainstreaming of migration into the line ministries and government, within the government. And you see now that poses a challenge where we have a very good law, the Refugee Act, but sometimes if you visit maybe certain ministries, they are not privy to some of these specific tenets. Because in Kenya, of course, once a law has been legislated by the parliament, then it means it forms part of our modus operandi. So if you realize if it's not mainstream within all the ministries or maybe the departments, then sometimes there's usually friction where at one particular point, one ministry is maybe moving in the same wavelength, but then has that. So how do we look at curing that? Of course, within some of the interventions we're doing is providing the evidence best, as he's talking about. When we're having those particular forums coming in, we're picking some of the good practices and using this evidence as evidence best to also advise the government on these are some of the best practices, so that even in terms of programming, the government is not going blind, but also having some very factual information on how best to approach the issue of refugee protection and management.
And in terms of integration, because when you're talking about integrating them into the society, into the community, in the larger Turkana County, in the larger Garissa County, it means they must get access to what they are required to: education, healthcare. Maybe in terms of ensuring that they get those services, how will the process look like?
It starts with laws and policies. It always starts with the legal frameworks. If you look at the Shirika plan, the transition phase now starts from around this year to around 2028, 2029. And the transition phase requires us to review the laws and policies to ensure that they inform integration. You will find in instances where integration as it is right now, if I give it a layman's term, if you go to Dadaab, you can't be able to identify who's a refugee and who's not. So in terms of the conversation, integration is already happening in the camps. Mitchell will tell you, if you go to Turkana, sometimes you'll find the host communities, they've intermarried, they do business with each other. They're all, integration at some level socially is there. But the one that we are looking for is social economic integration in terms of laws and policies and in terms of practice. Let me give you a scenario. When I was working in Dadaab back in the years around 2022, there was a fire in one of the markets. And there was a client who came to us in our legal aid clinic, which we do every single day. And he was telling us he lost 37 million in cash, which he buried inside his shop.
Oh.
Let me tell you how that aligns with now what policies and laws I'm talking about. He doesn't have access to the financial market. He doesn't have access to the bank. He doesn't have access to KRA. The alien card cannot be used to register KRA. It's one of the requirements to have a bank account, right? So you're looking at a scenario where you're making this ton of money and you have no way to take it. That's one example. That example is when Kenya changed its currency. Where do you take all that money? You take it, it's flagged. You're a refugee, why are you having 37 million? What's your source of income? What do you do? Most of these people are pastoralists, they are nomads. They sell lots and lots of cattle. And you know how valuable that business is. So we are looking even as a country in terms of upscaling our GDP. Where would that 37 million go if it was put into the banks? It will circle around the economy and do other services that will be required around that area. So we are just looking at a scenario where they have equitable share of resources, not only education, because at the education part, I think the camps are doing well, because the school at the camps, LWF, I think Window Trust Kenya are doing a tremendous job. But where do you go after you get your education? A lot of them have good certificates. A lot of them have gone to even Cambridge universities outside Europe. And then you come back and you seek employment. Like you, Hashim, he wants to be a news anchor, right? And then you have to go and do qualifications. You have to acquire a work permit. You have to, first of all, move from the camp and come to Nairobi. You will require a movement pass for you to even first move. And the duration of stay, and how long are you going to stay. Most of them study here, most of them do business here, but they have to have a documentation on why they're here. But if you're looking at other countries, refugees can freely move around the country. So the first aspect is movement. Second aspect, documentation. The other part is the laws and policies that are inclusive. Are they implemented well? Because the Refugees Act reaffirms the standpoint of the government of Kenya that the rights of refugees must be recognized, recognition, promotion, and protection. If you look at the Refugees Act, the first statement, it says this is just, it's an act of parliament to recognize, promote, and protect. And what does it reaffirm? It reaffirms the international conventions that we already signed. They were already here. 1951 UN Convention, 1967 UAE Convention on the aspects of Africa. So what we are looking for right now in terms of documentation, rights, just streamlining this, making sure that if I'm a Kenyan citizen and you're a refugee, the alien card that you have and the ID that you have similar status. I can get financial markets, I can get financial loans, I can get business registration services using what I already have without having to change my identity or having to integrate myself, just staying within my refugee space.
And maybe just on the same, because you rightly mentioned about the incident in 2022. And through our advocacy measures, we were able to also ask the government in terms of, with the Refugee Act, because it was passed in 2021, but the regulations were missing. So the government, of course, through its own initiative and also through stakeholder engagement, they were able to pass the regulations in 2024. And some of the positives that we're able to see, in case example, as is rightly mentioned, is the government gazetting. I think the former, the current deputy president, who was then the CS for Interior, gazetted some of the documents that can allow refugees to access services, to include the refugee ID card, the asylum seekers pass, the movement pass. So you see now with that, this particular individual, when we're working with them through the legal aid clinics, they're able now to register a bank account. We have now the private sector coming in to also play a crucial role in terms of knowing your customer. We have the banking regulations, which introduces a component where refugees can also maybe do banking with these institutions. So I think, to be fair also to the government, there's some positive initiatives, but as you rightly mentioned, the policy have to inform what is within the context. And that is the best practice for us when you're talking about the social change and systemic change, so that the views of the people are always collected, but also on the systemic change, if there may be legal regulatory frameworks that require amendment, then the relevant bodies, that is the County Assembly, the National Assembly, Senate, are able now to step into that pedestal and provide that guidance.
And you rightly said it, but what are these gaps, especially what you're rightly saying is that there's gaps between the policy, especially when it comes to the Refugees Act of 2021, and the actual services they can access. So where is that gap and how can it be bridged?
Yeah, thank you for that. So if you look at the policy, as I mentioned first, Kenya is always lauded for having very progressive. One, the Constitution of Kenya, in terms of ensuring that there's the free, basic, compulsory education. But now the challenge comes in on resource allocation, because if you look at the budget-making process, if you look at the location may be given to the education sector, may be given to the health sector. Now that is where the teething of the issues come, because on a human rights perspective, it provides that it's free to all. But now when you come about and realize maybe the resources either within the country or maybe from donations, because if you look at some of the comprehensive refugee response framework and the global refugee forum, they were talking about the issue of burden sharing and finding homegrown solutions. But it's the tying cap is the resources. If the resources do not match the initiatives, that is where the teething challenges come. So that if, for instance, we're talking about free basic compulsory education with a population of almost 835,000, then it means also on its own volition or maybe through the donor support, the government takes that initiative of when allocations of funds for the education sector are being debated either in parliament or maybe at the cabinet level, then they're infusing all these evidence-based. And remember what I mentioned about the good practices. If you're talking about the healthcare system, we have the government also trying to also encourage refugees to also register with chief. So, but the key question, of course, for us when you look at the implementation challenges, it is usually resource-strained. So that if from the government, the hosting government, the resources they have is not even sufficient for the citizens, you can imagine now for the refugee constituents. Yeah.
And Mohammed, coming to you, earlier on Mitchell clearly stated that you have goodwill with the county assembly, especially of Turkana and the county governments of Turkana and Garissa, in terms of ensuring and using these particular institutions that have been put there within the devolved units in ensuring these people get the right documentation, especially an ID.
Yes.
You know, that's a basic right in this particular country. To ensure that they get those IDs so that they can move freely, why don't you flex those muscles and ensure the county governments push it to the national government for those refugees to gain access to them?
Oh, okay. Let me say this, sir. For you to understand refugee rights, you have to understand what documents they have to get, right? Refugees under the Refugees Act are supposed to get alien cards, not the national identity cards. However, there's that aspect of durable solutions. The durable solutions are three. Refugees can either be locally integrated into the Kenyan citizenship process, and they give up their refugee status, get national ID, and then they become a Kenyan. Secondly, they can be part of a resettlement process initiated by UNHCR, which they'll be taken to another third world country, of which now, if you're looking at it right now, it's going down as expected because Trump doesn't want any, and the countries are normally USA and Canada. The third one is for them to voluntarily repatriate to their country of origin. But there's conditions to that as well. You can only voluntarily repatriate sometimes when there's a bit of peace and you feel like you can go back. No one wants to go back right now. Everyone wants to move forward, right? Which comes back to the conversation you stated earlier about peace, diplomatic peace all across. Because if you have peace in these East African regions, then many of the refugees still want to go back and live their lives where they were. Maybe they were influential, maybe they feel they can make it there. But the durable solutions remain three. The one that is looking like kind of likely right now is voluntary repatriation. Integration is what we are moving towards, but we are not moving towards integration of them moving into the Kenyan citizenship process, right? It's voluntary for them to do so. It's still part of what they have to get. But in terms of us using the political goodwill for them to get the IDs, the Department of Refugee Services have been very, very helpful in terms of registering refugees. First of all, if you're an asylum seeker, many people confuse refugees with asylum seekers. They're two different entities. If you're an asylum seeker, every refugee is an asylum seeker, but every asylum seeker is not a refugee. And the difference is always in the registration bit. All refugees have documentation and are approved under UNHCR mandate, and the DRS has recognized them. So for them to get refugee documents is the first step because it gives you access first to the food. They get monthly rations, of which now it's looking a bit lower because of the differentiated assistance model, which comes in 4 ambits. It's categorized according to the state of your vulnerability. So you'll be categorized depending on what you have, or if you have business, or if you're too vulnerable, you're put in a category where you'll get the food. So in terms of them getting documentation, it's about getting the refugee documentation. But let's look at the documentation in itself. You asked about the gaps that we have in laws and policies. The first gap we have in laws and policies is the documentation bit. Because I've mentioned it before, and I will always mention it, because it's still an area that RCK, we are still looking to advocate and seeing whether there will be harmonization. A foreigner comes into the country, they get an alien card. A refugee comes into the country, they go through the refugee status determination process. If they're not a prima facie refugee, they get the refugee alien card. Both of them alien cards, issued under 2 different acts. One issued under the Refugees Act, one issued under the Kenya Citizenship and Immigrations Act. Both alien cards, different functions. You see foreigners moving around, investing, having bank accounts, buying hotels, and they're not Kenyan. they're using alien cards because you have to have proper documentation for you to be here, correct? The refugee alien card, as it is right now, is only for identification purposes. So you can't use your alien card to move from Dadaab to Garissa and from Kakuma to Lodwar. You'll require an additional document called the movement pass, as Mitchell has mentioned. The movement pass will articulate where you're going, when will you be staying there, is it for education, is it for medical purposes. It's still hard for them to get these documents because you can't get, sometimes it's hard for them to get documents if they want to go just for leisure or something. I know for some Muslims who want to go for pilgrimage and Hajj and Umrah and all those things, they get the, I think it's called travel, there's a name for it that DRS offers it to them. So movement in the camps is still very well restricted, even with that ID card that you're stating, the alien card. The alien card only helps you to identify yourself, but if you don't, if you're not identified, first of all, no one recognizes you. That's the first important bit. You're not included in the 800,000, or 800,000 includes refugees and asylums, but there's the number for registered refugees. So if you're not included in that, first of all, you don't enjoy the benefits under the Refugees Act.
So maybe just to also come back to your question on the what we're also doing maybe as an organization, because pre the Refugee Act, we saw the percentage of registered refugees was a bit low. Right now, if you look at the statistic package, we are having close to 74 registered refugee with ID cards, and around 26% thereabout that are not, they're still asylum seekers under the process. Because the other thing, of course, we have to bear in mind is that on daily basis, even as we're speaking right now, we have new arrivals, maybe new people coming in. So it would mean at no point would have maybe the status determination fully complied with, because it would require, even as we are receiving new people, they're getting into the status determination. So we've been able to push the conversation with the government, that is the Department of Refugee Services, so that even in terms of issuance of these refugee ID cards, and I also wish to applaud also DRS, because they came out in terms of awareness creation, I think using the leverage on technology, where they're able to inform the refugees who had already gone through the whole process and needed to collect the ID cards, because at one point also we were faced with another challenge where someone is to be issued with the refugee ID card, but they have not gone to collect the ID. It is not different. It's also synonymous with Kenyans, where you realize sometimes the government would communicate and say they are collected national identification cards within the system. So again, if you look at that, that is for me where I say that is misuse of resources, because at the back end someone took some time, reviewed this particular individual, processed the documents, and now there's no collection. But I think once the awareness was done maybe through the social media platforms, we used the forums within the different entities as organizations, we saw a big uptake of refugees coming to collect these documents. Now also on the same aspect on documentation, because we would also not wish as an organization only having us push the conversation on behalf of the refugees. Now we're trying also to empower them to also speak up, because it is also important. From where I sit, I'm the one who knows how the shoe fits me or pinches me. So we also encourage also the refugees to be able to speak on some of these issues, either on access to service delivery, so that we are not having that blanket approach of we are not accessing education yet. When we see the Ministry of Education giving out results for the KCSE, there's some refugees who are being acknowledged having performed well. So it means there's some level of access to education. When you're talking about the healthcare, we're not putting that blanket that no one is accessing maybe the healthcare, but also asking for those who are not able to access the healthcare system, what is the issue? So if it requires maybe a reform within the law, that is where as RCK now we go ask the conversation to either the relevant party. Because if you look at again the constitution on the 4th schedule, some of the national functions and county functions, refugee management still remains a national function. But of course, in terms of service delivery, where water is devolved, you realize that the county comes in. So how do they ensure that this complementarity between the national and county government? That's where DRS comes in to bridge that gap, ensuring that in case of these coordinated efforts on integrated service delivery, they're bringing the conversation. We have what we call in the Refugee Act, the Refugee Advisory Committee. And this, of course, has different line ministries to include even finance, to include devolution, to include education, to include health. And that's why I was saying sometimes if it's possible that within the different line ministries, they're able now to have this advisory committee sitting, present evidence-based, whether it's in the water sector, and then now advise the CS, because the advisory committee is supposed to advise the cabinet secretary in that particular, where the docket of the refugees is being domiciled, on issues affecting refugee management. So for me, that is where we're talking about as RCK, providing as much evidence best to inform good policy, inclusive policies. Yeah.
And maybe talk to us about, Mohammed, when it comes to inclusive refugee response program, what do you mean and why is it important?
Very important. I think it has been touched a bit by my colleague, Mitchell. We've always been talking about inclusivity, about involving refugees in the planning and everything. The Refugees Act 2021 reaffirms whatever we had, and which is a beautiful, beautiful document, our Constitution of Kenya, under Chapter 11, where we had the devolved government. So the county governments that we have right now, I can imagine if we had the refugee population and we had 8 provinces, how that would look like, how much funds would go into helping refugees in terms of inclusivity and the public resources that they would require. So whatever we are looking at the Shirika plan is very much inclusive, socio-economic integration for refugees into what is already existing and also creating things that were lacking. And that will be informed by the policy reviews and impact assessments as RCK in terms of advocacy we will do. If we feel like there'll be environmental impact assessments that will come up when settlement is happening, because right now they'll be moving to different areas. If you look at Dadaab, you'll see Ifo2 and Cambios camps were not gazetted as camps because they were closed for a very long time, since 2015. But then again, they were reopened. The question is, why were they being reopened? It's because the refugees population is still growing. A camp that was supposed to host 90,000 and 100,000 is hosting around 300 to 200,000. So these additional camps, and RCK was at the front and the center of this process. And we did a lot of legal opinions and policy reviews on why we would go with the settlement as opposed to camps. And as we sit here today, Ifo2 is a settlement area, not a camp. So we already know the camps that are there. There's Dagahale, there's Hagadera, and there's Ifo. But then there's another additional camp called Ifo2, and then there's an additional camp called Cambios. When you're looking at integration, and let me tell you a very funny thing, Ifo2 when it was closed and Cambios when it was, both camps were closed at the same time. But if you go back to that camp at Ifo2, the structures remain the same. You know why? Because the host community assimilated that place and still were living in those places. We had the level 4 hospitals, beautiful schools. We had a whole vegetation area. People were doing poultry farming. People were doing kitchen gardening. So the host community, in terms of integration, took care of that place so that when we reopened 12 to 11 years later, we didn't need to do a lot of rehabilitation. We just did a few reconstruction, gave everyone the square plots. Of course, if you look at research, Kakuma are way ahead in whatever in terms of Garissa, what we're trying to do. Kakuma, they had the Kalobey Integrated Social Economic Development Plan. I think now it's in the closing phase. They did the first phase, they did the second phase, I think they're around the third phase. And they were trying to see how settlement will work. We give you a small section of land, you can move around, you can do your farming, you can have your cows there. Don't have to live in camps, and you have a structure for yourself. Just a little bit of empowering. So in terms of inclusiveness, if you look at the two counties, we are almost coming at par with each other in terms of inclusive service delivery. And for RCK, I think we sit at the center. We advocate for the government to bring in these inclusive laws, review, draft, implement. And at the other hand, we are also sensitizing the community on what they're supposed to do in terms of peaceful coexistence. At the other hand, we're also working with security forces in terms of asylum and immigration related cases. Look, if these people come in, you don't need to harass them, you don't need to take money off them. If these people come into their borders, we have to first analyze whether they are a threat to national security or they're genuine refugees. But the process can still be done very carefully and in a humanitarian way. So we are looking at a 360 angle where we are working with different armpits. We're still working with national NGOs who are like-minded in areas of gender-based violence, areas to do with women and girls empowerment, areas to do with asylum and migration, areas to do with documentation. All these areas and all these facets, when they come together, it informs the conversation on inclusive refugee response.
Maybe just also to mention, this of course was an initiative by a donor alliance. We have the Danish Embassy, we had the Lego Foundation, we had the Grundfos Foundation and Novo Nordisk, who felt that instead of using their resources to support different initiatives, why don't they come up as an alliance and see how best to push one conversation on inclusive refugee response. And just to maybe answer your question, this is a very high-level policy-driven initiative to support the government of Kenya so that we have inclusive, people-centered policies that strengthen the service delivery. So that if you look at the inclusive refugee response plan, it has a bias on education, water, health, and self-reliance. And why is this important? Remember I mentioned about some of the international initiatives on global self-compact orderly migration, where it's talking about for human rights to exist, specifically in the migration concern, then basic services have to be guaranteed. So it's coming in to strengthen the government service delivery. So it is not moving at a parallel angle, but it's asking what is the government doing maybe in issues of access to water? What is the government doing in education? And then they're coming in to strengthen those systems so that when you're talking about integrated service delivery, you'd realize from RCK's point of view, when you're engaging maybe with the county or the national government, those training capacity enhancement workshops that we have, it's only to improve or maybe push the conversation on some information, basically on the human rights-based approach that might be lacking. So that even on the national or the county government, they're not leaving anyone behind, be it the women, be it the children, because again, statistics do not lie. If the statistics package say women and children are the majority, then even in terms of our designing of our programs as a government or as a national or county government, even as partners, we need to factor in this specific number. So the project, of course, is heavily biased on access to basic services, but I think it's also speaking to what he mentioned about Shirika Plan, because the first phase of Shirika Plan is strengthening systems, the systems building. So when you talk about system, again, is the government delivery systems. Yeah.
And how will the program especially aid RCK and other actors who are actively within those camps to make your work easier?
The Shirika Plan. I would say it will make the work very easy. We're still we're still in the transition phase and see how that will happen, but it will very much help us in terms of trying to provide integrated service delivery. Because if you're trying to, there's this famous quote, and it's not a famous one, because it was mentioned by someone by passing. So it's saying, if I teach you how to fish, then what are you still doing at my pond? And it begs the question, is refugee status permanent? It's not. The refugee status is supposed to be temporary until we find a durable solution for you, right? But looking at what we have right now, we have refugees from 1991. We have third generation of refugees living in camps. There are people who have never seen Somalia. There's people who've never seen South Sudan and Rwanda and Burundi. Always been here. But of course you see the larger population, around 56 to 57% of refugees are Somali, right? So if you're looking at the status of people that have been here, they don't understand, the third generation don't understand why the parents don't want them to move from the camp to seek a better life elsewhere. That's why you hear all these cases of trafficking and smuggling. People have been captured around in Libya, been tortured, families have been told to raise money for these people. It is happening. It's a conversation that is happening because you can't keep youth that are determined and have ambition to stay in camp areas, right? So what the Shirika Plan will do for us, which will be a step, once we build the systems and we have a system that is working and is harmonized, and institutionally it is capacity strengthened to its full capacity, then we see how the integration will span out. Because at the end of the day, there's political goodwill, yes, but there's also goodwill from the community itself on how they'll take it. It's a conversation we started ever since the Shirika plan was tabled, before it was even signed by the president. We're trying to get views because we are very, as I tell you, we sit at the center. We get the views from the community, we have the government, we have the partners here. So we're getting views from all angles. And when we do this, we have evidence-based research. So the community's attitude is changing towards integration. It may not have been there before. The host communities were not perceptive to the idea that the refugees can move around and do business. A bit skeptical about how that would happen. But if you look at it, it's currently changing because the county agenda in itself and the national agenda that we used to have before, the Shirika plan was there before. It's not a new narrative. It was called the Marshall Plan before. Before the Shirika plan came, we already had the Gisedip, which is for Garissa, and Kisedip running. So it's not something that is entirely new. It's something, the conversation that has been going for quite some time. But the government came with a nationwide program now that will cover the whole nation. So the Shirika plan, that's how it came in. So in terms of us, we are foreseeing that if the Shirika plan comes into full effect, and if you go through the document and you look at it cleanly and the budget and what it's intending to do, it's a big plus, not only for us, but for communities we serve, the host community, the displaced community, the refugees themselves, the asylum seekers. It's a big plus for them because you're looking at a place where you don't need to fight to get your food, you don't need to fight to get education, you don't need to stay in camps or shelled to be able to prosper and progress into your career and your life and your personal attributes and goals. So in terms of that, I would say it's a plus for us and for the government of Kenya and also for the communities.
Maybe just to add one line on it, and I'm using the word, if the government fully implements Shirika plan, then the positive we see as RCK is it will be able to incorporate migration into policy making, because for us that is where we see a lot of, I would say, added or value addition if migration is considered in all the policy making. So depending on whichever ministry, so long as they're doing their role, if they have at the back of mind that the government of Kenya, through its elected representatives, have accepted to host refugees at one particular point, then migration also needs to be incorporated in policy making. Yeah.
And also, as you talk about the afterwards, if it is fully implemented, they will be integrated into communities. Some may even decide to leave Garissa in totality and Turkana in totality and come into Kenya inside Nairobi, Kisumu, go where opportunities are. Yeah. So in terms of coexisting peacefully with other Kenyans, is there a plan for that?
Yeah, I would say yes. In the first instance, of course, I would, as a lawyer, I would make reference to what the law provides. And if you look at the Refugee Act of 2021, it talks about the cabinet secretary having the power to designate counties. The current, of course, we have Turkana and Garissa County as designated counties. But as the conversation is going on and we're having it being government-led from Office of the President, then it means this conversation will even stretch to how about the other 47 counties? And if you're talking about the other 47 counties, that is where we're talking about the goodwill, because within the different county assembly forums, for us, our message is when the County Assembly of Turkana or the County Assembly of Garissa is going to this forum, they're also spreading the same message on, you can be able to start thinking about legislating laws on refugee management, so that once the government designates maybe the counties, a different, let's say Bungoma County, or even Kakamega County, they need to be able to now know that this is already something that has been practiced by another county. So it is not coming as new information. That for me is where we are now bridging the peaceful coexistence. So that even within these specific counties, if the leadership through the county or the representatives from the national government are already starting to have this conversation that as a country we have what we call Shirika Plan, where we're talking about systems building until 2028 there. This is an opportunity for us to incorporate migration into our policy making, so that even if there are questions asked on resources, that is now for me, I was saying, even from the governors forum, when they're meeting, they can be able to push this conversation forward and say, how about we get more resources in terms of devolution as a result of being the designated hosting counties. Yeah.
The reason why I asked that, because Mohammed talked about earlier on, they have studied, they have gone even abroad, they have those certificates, but applying those certificates and the skills they have acquired has been an issue. Maybe going forward with RRPP as well as other initiatives that are being implemented within those particular camps, maybe give us a contrast view. Is this something that is only being implemented in Kenya or in other parts of the East African region? Or maybe what have you drawn from other parts of this particular African continent that you're currently inculcating it within the camps, Mohammed? Oh,
okay. I'll quote this from a refugee, and they quoted as Uganda being heaven for refugees. And I deeply asked myself why, but after doing a lot of research, I found out that they were gazetted around 11 settlement areas. There's actually, I think, Kandaini or something. So they have settlement areas. So whatever I said before on the East African Forum is everything that they shared. And South Sudan was also there. So whatever they shared with us is like, there's countries that have laws and policies that are not as inclusive, but it's working. Like they're not using policies for integration. The policy is yet to catch up with whatever advancements they made. But a lot of that came down once we asked, it's coming to the culture and the Ugandan culture in itself. The person who was representing Uganda, I can't remember the professor's name, was telling us generally in Uganda, they welcome foreigners as guests, and they don't discriminate against people who come into the country, whether you're a refugee or a foreigner or a tourist or a visitor. So generally the culture is welcoming. So what happens if the notions and the positive attitudes change? Then the laws and policies will have to catch up with whatever the community is already doing. Like I said, integration has been happening since 1991, because when they came in, the host community had to be informed that there are refugees coming in, that we need to make this space, we have to construct a refugee camp here and here, and they were there. And if they didn't agree, what would have happened? Killings and all that. Of course, there was a small portion of it at that time, but they welcomed the refugees with open arms. Like I said, it's just us. The community is already perceptive to the idea that integration will happen. What actually happens that I feel brings the division is bringing programs specifically for refugees and tell them this is for refugees, and then tell them this is only for host community. If you bring programs and you tell them this program is very much for host community and is also very much for the refugees, and you can partake in both, because they're already living together. If I sit here and you sit here and we are sitting across from each other and I have rights that you don't, how would you feel? Already peaceful coexistence has a dent in it. What you're trying to do is engage in these conversations in the community and up top, and making sure that the government streamline these services and also harmonize the policies, so that if you have these provisions for citizens, try and have it in a similar manner for them. The Constitution of Kenya, when it says every individual, it means every individual, including refugees. When it's talking about every citizen, sometimes people think it's only citizens. It fairly also runs across, because if you look at Article 43 of our Constitution of Kenya, it states that anyone who comes into the border of Kenya is first of all entitled to humane treatment in terms of fair basic services, food, shelter, water. And then medical and security screening come after, because we owe you that part. For humanitarian purposes, we owe you that part. And then we'll see later on if you're a danger to security. There's a lot of laws on it. The Refugees Act offers, if you've been dishonest in your application as a refugee status, there's procedure to that. You'll be informed and all that. So
quickly, Because
quickly, just adding on it, I think on the certification, the government, through also partners who've been able to push the conversation, they've introduced something called recognition of prior learning. And some of this certification is we've seen the government using the Kenya National Qualifications Authority to be able to vet and onboard some of these certifications. So there's work in progress. So I think it's just now to ask the government to continue with our good practice.
Okay, thank you so much, gentlemen. That is Michel Ambasu, the Refugee Consortium of Kenya RCK Field Coordinator at Kakuma Operations, as well as Mohammed Ahmed, a Program Manager and Legal Aid at RSK. Thank you so much for coming in today. And of course, that is the situation not only in Kakuma, but in Dadaab as well. This is a conversation that we'll be having as and when we get more details, not only from the government stakeholders such as RSK, RCK and other organizations that are operating within those particular camps. That concludes our first hour.